Hello, everyone. You've probably heard the cliche 1,000 times before. Someone thought their life was perfect until one single day shattered that illusion. Well, that was me, Ryan Hayes. I was married to Helen, an incredible woman, and we had a wonderful 6-year-old daughter named Sandra. Helen and I met back in college during my senior year and her junior year. It felt like love at first sight, and we got married just a month after she graduated. With my engineering degree, I secured a stable job at a national firm, while Helen started working as a legal assistant at a prominent law firm. When Sandra was born 2 years later, Helen decided to leave her job and focus on being a full-time mom. Those years felt idyllic, almost like we were living a dream. But everything began to change when Sandra started kindergarten. That's when Helen chose to return to her previous role at the law firm. Looking back, the signs were there, glaring at me in plain sight, but I was too naive, or maybe too trusting, to see them for what they were. I had absolute faith that Helen loved me just as much as I loved her. Now, I can see how wrong I was. The shift began when she re-entered the workforce. Her wardrobe became noticeably more provocative. Our once thriving sex life dwindled into non-existence. She worked increasingly late hours, brushing off my concerns when I brought up how little time she spent with Sandra and me. "It's a big opportunity," she'd say, claiming she was doing it for our future, for financial security. A few months before it all unraveled, I met her boss, Brian Price, at the firm's Christmas party. From the moment I laid eyes on him, I didn't like the guy. He came off as arrogant, his attitude toward me dismissive. I watched him and Helen like a hawk during the event, but there wasn't anything overtly suspicious between them. If something was happening, they were meticulous about keeping it under wraps. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then everything collapsed. Sandra's kindergarten year was ending, and her last day of school marked the beginning of a weekend with my parents. I had planned for that weekend to be a chance for Helen and me to reconnect, to rekindle what we'd lost. I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, just the two of us, with a nice dinner and a movie. But the moment I walked into the kitchen, I realized my plans were not going to unfold as I'd hoped. Helen was coming down the stairs, dressed to the nines in a short, elegant dress and high heels, her hair styled perfectly, her makeup flawless. She looked stunning, like she was about to attend some glamorous event. "Wow, you look amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "I wish you'd told me we were going out. I would have rushed home to get ready. Just give me a minute, and I'll change." "Where are we going?" She smirked, and for the first time, her expression felt cold, unfamiliar. It twisted my stomach. "We're not going anywhere," she said. "I'm going out, but not with you." I froze, her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "What? What are you talking about?" "I have a date," she said casually, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. "And this is just the beginning. Things are going to be different from now on. My boss is picking me up tonight, and we're spending the evening together. I've booked a hotel downtown." It felt like the ground had been yanked out from under me. "What the hell are you saying?" I demanded, my voice rising with disbelief. "You need to calm down and accept it," she said, her tone eerily matter-of-fact. "This is how it's going to be. I'll be back sometime Sunday." "Like hell you will," I snapped. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back." She didn't even flinch. "No, Ryan, I will be coming back. This is our home, and we're staying married. You'll live here, and so will I. You need to understand something. I still love you, but I need more. If you make this difficult, you'll be the one leaving. And believe me, you don't want that. It wouldn't be good for Sandra to lose her father, would it?" Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. As I stood there, reeling, the doorbell rang. She moved to answer it, and when the door opened, in walked Brian Price. "How did he take it?" Brian asked her. "Not well," Helen replied coolly. "I think you should explain the consequences of noncompliance." Brian was an average-looking man, roughly my size, maybe an inch or two shorter, but his demeanor was anything but average. He turned to me with a smug expression. "Mr. Hayes, I think we need to have a little chat." "Chat?" I scoffed, my anger bubbling over. "The only thing I want to do is throw you out of my house." He smirked. "You're welcome to try, but I wouldn't recommend it. My driver is outside. and he's not here to just hold the door open. If you lay a hand on me, you'll spend the night in jail. Now, why don't you sit down so we can talk like adults?" I glanced at the door and saw a large man standing just outside. The odds weren't in my favor. Gritting my teeth, I reluctantly sat down. "Good," Brian said, oozing smugness. "Let's keep this civilized. Your wife agreed to take on additional responsibilities when she became my personal assistant. That includes fulfilling certain personal needs. We've been involved for the past 6 months, but sneaking around has grown tiresome for both of us. Moving forward, this is how things will work. You and Helen will remain married. You'll continue to be Sandra's father and Helen's husband, at least in name. But when it comes to intimacy, that's my role now." I exploded, standing up and shouting, "This is insane. I'm not going to stand for this. I'll divorce her." Brian remained calm, almost bored. "I wouldn't advise that, Mr. Hayes. I'm a high-powered attorney, and I have connections you can't even begin to imagine. If you file for divorce, you'll lose everything: your home, your savings, and you'll still be paying alimony while Helen stays with me. And that's not all. If you push me, I'll make sure you never see your daughter again. You'll face accusations of child molestation. The charges will stick, and you'll serve time. Even after you're released, visitation will never be an option." Brian leaned in closer, his face a mask of cold calculation. "If you refuse to cooperate, things will go downhill fast for you," he warned. "Your employer will terminate you immediately, and your reputation? Destroyed. Your friends and family will abandon you. You'll be left completely alone, with nothing." I sat frozen, unable to process his words. Brian's voice lowered, growing even more menacing. "Now, I trust you're smart enough not to do anything foolish. If you breathe a word of this arrangement to my wife, or anyone else, you'll face everything I just described. And on top of that, you'll get a visit from my driver and his associates. And don't think running is an option. We'll find you no matter where you go. So be a good man and accept your new reality." Then, with a sinister smirk, he added, "Your wife, by the way, is an exceptional assistant." And he leaned in, his tone dripping with malice. "She gives the best BJs." I was too stunned to react as Helen, my wife, my partner, walked out the door with him. Her boss, her lover. My world had just been turned inside out, and I had no idea what to do. The only escape I could think of was the bottom of a bottle. I drank until I passed out. When I woke up Saturday morning, the house was quiet. Helen hadn't come home. The silence was suffocating, and the hangover only made it worse. By Sunday morning, there was still no sign of her. Later that day, I picked Sandra up from my parents' house. As we drove home, her wide, innocent eyes met mine in the rearview mirror. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her little voice filled with curiosity. My throat tightened. The truth burned on my tongue. Mommy betrayed us both. But instead, I forced a weak smile. "Mommy had to work," I said. Her face fell, and the disappointment in her eyes cut me to the core. It took everything I had not to break down in front of her. Helen finally returned Sunday night, but I avoided her. I stayed in the guest room, pretending to be asleep when she came home. Thankfully, she didn't come in. I wasn't sure I could have faced her without losing my temper. The next morning, I was up early, helping Sandra get ready for school. When Helen joined us, she barely spoke to me, focusing entirely on Sandra. As we headed out, she kissed Sandra goodbye and then leaned in to kiss me. I turned away and walked out the door. That evening, after Sandra was asleep, Helen marched down to the basement, where I had retreated to my makeshift man cave. "Are we going to have a problem?" she asked sharply, standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips. I looked up at her, my voice cold. "When you say we, are you asking if I have an issue with you spending the weekend with your boss? Is that the problem you mean?" Her jaw tightened. She was ready for a fight. "Look, I didn't plan for this to happen," she said defensively. "It started innocently enough. Brian and I would share morning coffee. He liked the special creamer I bring to the office. I couldn't stop myself. I'm sure he was eager to share some of his own special creamer." I shot back, my tone dripping with disgust. "Don't be crude, Ryan," she snapped. "Brian is persuasive. You know how I've always said I don't like sushi? The truth is, I'd never tried it before. Brian convinced me to give it a shot. He said it's an incredible aphrodisiac. She hesitated, then continued, her voice matter of fact. The first time I tried sushi was also the first time we were intimate. Her lack of remorse was staggering. I'm sorry, Ryan, she added, though there was no sincerity in her tone, but it was good. And Brian promised me a promotion to his personal assistant. Think about the benefits. My salary is significantly higher now. I'll get to travel with him and meet important people. This arrangement will be good for us in the long run. Good for us? I echoed, incredulous. Oh, and another thing, she added, as if it were an afterthought. Brian said you could still be intimate with me, but only under certain conditions. My stomach turned. I can't wait to hear this, I said, the sarcasm thick in my voice. Helen hesitated. You can only have sex with me after Brian has been with me, she explained, her tone almost apologetic. He insists on that. And according to him, it'll happen often. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. How generous of Brian, I said, my voice laced with fury. He's giving me the privilege of sloppy seconds. Truly, he's a saint. You can't talk to me like that. Helen snapped. Ryan, you need to get on board with this. It's not forever. 2, maybe 3 years. After that, we'll be in a great position for our future. I stared at her, disbelief and anger swirling inside me. You actually believe that, don't you? You think that after Brian's done using you, I'm just going to pick up the pieces and grow old with you? What happens when he decides he wants to put a baby in you? Do I get the honor of raising his kid too? Helen's face fell. She couldn't meet my eyes. You're not already pregnant, are you? I asked, dread creeping into my voice. No, she said quickly. But he has mentioned wanting me to stop taking the pill in a few months. I told him I'd wait until you were on board. I stared at her in disbelief, shaking my head. Get out of my sight. Helen paused at the top of the stairs, turning back briefly. I'll be in our bed, waiting, she said. Just remember, once I stop the pill, you won't have access to me until, well, you know. Her words were the breaking point. I moved permanently into the guest room and spent more time in the basement. For Sandra's sake, I worked hard to keep life as normal as possible, but beneath the surface, I was unraveling. Over the next week, I began researching Brian Price. His reputation was just as ruthless as he'd claimed. His power and influence were undeniable. I consulted a divorce lawyer, desperate for guidance. Her assessment was bleak. Pursuing a divorce would ruin me. She knew Brian Price's tactics well and warned that he wouldn't hesitate to fabricate accusations of child abuse against me. Divorce isn't an option, she said, but she offered one glimmer of hope: gather evidence. A recording of Helen and Brian explicitly discussing their plans could serve as leverage. She suggested a discreet voice-activated recorder, something small and inconspicuous. I purchased one designed to look like a pin and slipped it into Helen's purse. It felt like a long shot, but it was all I had. I began exploring other options. To avoid leaving a digital trail, I used public computers at the library. Hours of research led me to an extreme idea, something I never thought I'd consider. Desperation was driving me now. 3 hours away, I found a tiny, disreputable Oriental supply store. I pulled on an old hat, sunglasses, and a hoodie, doing my best to remain unrecognizable. When I arrived at the small, dimly lit store, I was relieved to find it empty except for an elderly man standing behind the counter. Approaching cautiously, I leaned in and asked in a low voice, "I'm looking for tetrodotoxin and dimethylmercury." The old man studied me for a moment before a knowing smile crept across his face. "Ah, trouble with a cheating wife?" he asked, his tone more amused than surprised. I managed a faint smile in response. "Do you have what I need?" "I do," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But it's not cheap. $1,500, cash only. I'm assuming you don't want any record of this transaction." Anticipating the expense, I had brought $2,000 in cash with me. I counted out $1,500 in 20s and placed the stack on the counter. The old man nodded, disappearing into a back room. When he returned, He handed me a small paper bag containing 2 vials. Handle these with care, he instructed. A small amount, administered over time, will achieve the desired effect. Use these, he added, slipping 2 syringes into the bag. They'll help with dosing. Don't let the substances touch your skin. Mix them into a liquid for ingestion. It's the safest method. I took the bag without another word and hurried back to my car. The substances I'd acquired, tetrodotoxin and dimethylmercury, were both as deadly as they were elusive. Tetrodotoxin, derived from the infamous fugu fish, was a toxin that could accumulate in the body with fatal consequences if improperly handled. Dimethylmercury was even more dangerous. A single drop could penetrate the skin and cause irreversible damage. Both were slow-acting, their effects building over time and making them nearly impossible to trace. In the event of discovery, the symptoms could easily be attributed to contaminated seafood, such as bad sushi. The brilliance of my plan lay in its simplicity. Helen herself would unknowingly deliver the poison. She kept her special coffee creamer at home, only taking a bottle to work when the one at the office ran out. Months ago, when I asked why she didn't just store it all at work, she explained that she was worried someone might steal it. At the time, I thought it was an odd explanation, but now I understood. This creamer wasn't just for her. It was something she shared with Brian. The creamer, a non-dairy, shelf-stable product, was stored in a small case in our pantry. That was my opportunity. The case held 11 bottles, neatly arranged. I carefully removed one for closer inspection. The cap wasn't tamper-proof, but it was sealed with a layer of paper and foil underneath. Deciding to start with the less dangerous of the 2 substances, I prepared a syringe filled with tetrodotoxin. The dimethylmercury was far riskier to handle, so I wanted to perfect my method first. I inserted the syringe's needle carefully into the edge of the seal, ensuring the puncture would be nearly invisible. Slowly, I injected the liquid into the creamer, taking care not to leave any traces of tampering. Once satisfied, I repeated the process with the remaining 10 bottles. Then, with even more caution, I prepared the dimethylmercury and injected it into each bottle. By the time I was done, all 11 bottles were ready. 2 weeks later, I noticed that 1 bottle was missing. The case now held 10. My conscience began to nag at me, questioning whether I had crossed a line. But Helen's behavior quickly silenced any second thoughts. That Thursday, the ritual she called sushi night came around again. It was the same excuse she used every time she and Brian wanted to spend the night together under the guise of working late. Sandra and I ate dinner alone, as usual, and I tucked her into bed before retreating to my basement refuge. Later that evening, Helen swept in with her usual air of entitlement. "If you want to have sex with me, you've got 1 month," she announced. "Brian's decided I'm going off the pill in 4 weeks. After that, you won't have access anymore." Anger surged through me. "Let me get this straight," I said through clenched teeth. "You're giving me a brief window to sleep with my own wife before you try to have a child with your boss? How generous." Helen smirked, unfazed. "That's right. And don't use that word. I've told you how much I hate it." "Then I'll pass," I snapped. "I wouldn't touch you, whether or not his filth is involved." "Suit yourself," she said smugly, turning to leave. "I'll be upstairs in our bed. It's been a while since we've been intimate." She walked away with the self-satisfaction of someone who believed she'd won. Under my breath, I muttered, "You wouldn't recognize love if it stared you in the face." Some might say I should have just walked away, pursued a divorce. But given Brian's threats, his promises to ruin my life, destroy my reputation, and take Sandra from me, I saw no other choice. What I was doing was morally reprehensible, but in my mind, it was the only way to protect myself and my daughter. About a week later, another bottle was gone from the case. Now there were 9. It wasn't until a month after I'd prepared the bottles that I noticed the first signs of the toxins taking effect. Helen's complexion had grown noticeably paler, but it was her hands that caught my attention. During dinner, she kept flexing her fingers and rubbing them together. "Is everything okay, Helen?" I asked, doing my best to sound concerned. "I don't know," she replied, her tone uncertain. "My fingers feel numb, like when your hand falls asleep. It's been happening for about a week, and I've been feeling a little short of breath. It's probably nothing," I said lightly. Maybe it's just stress. Anything at work bothering you? Her expression darkened slightly, and I caught a faint sneer. No, work is great. Everything's great, she said firmly. I let it go, but inside, I knew the toxins were starting to work. 2 weeks later, the case was down to 8 bottles. They must have been drinking a lot of coffee, I thought, noting how quickly the creamer supply was dwindling. Meanwhile, Helen's symptoms were becoming impossible to ignore. Her body aches grew more severe, her shortness of breath worsened, and her once vibrant complexion had taken on an ashen hue. It was clear that whatever was happening to her was escalating. One Thursday evening, Helen came home earlier than usual, catching me off guard. "What are you doing here?" I asked, unable to resist the jab. "Isn't it sushi night?" "I'm not feeling well," she replied, her tone uncharacteristically subdued. "Brian isn't feeling great either, so we decided not to work late tonight." I smirked. "Well, that's poor timing, isn't it? You and Brian have that big project to deliver. Hard to finish the job when both of you are out of commission." Helen stepped closer, her voice lowering so Sandra wouldn't hear. "Don't be a jerk in front of our daughter. I'm going to lie down after dinner." Later that night, as I tucked Sandra into bed, I walked past the master bedroom and heard the unmistakable sound of Helen retching. I hesitated outside the bathroom door before pushing it open slightly. "Please tell me you're not already pregnant," I said quietly. "Screw you," she snapped, glaring at me through watery eyes. "I just went off the pill last week, so no, I'm not pregnant. You could show some compassion, you know? I'm really sick." "Compassion," I scoffed, shaking my head. "That's rich coming from you. My wife, my real wife, died the day she started working for that asshole. You were replaced by someone I can't respect, let alone feel compassion for. If you think you're getting sympathy from me, you're mistaken." I turned and walked away, leaving her hunched over the toilet. The next morning, Helen was still in bed when I took Sandra to daycare. I didn't bother checking on her. I didn't care. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Helen. "What do you want?" I asked bluntly. "I need you to take me to the hospital," she said, her voice weak. "What's wrong?" I asked, more confused than concerned. "I'm sick, but it's not just me. Brian had a stroke. They said it's serious." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're seriously asking me to take you to see your lover in the hospital?" "Please, Ryan," she begged. "This isn't funny. He could die." It might have raised suspicions if I refused, so I reluctantly took the afternoon off. When I got home, Helen looked terrible, pale and shaky. I helped her into the car, whistling a cheerful tune the entire drive just to irritate her. She called me every name she could think of, but I didn't care. At the hospital, we ran into Brian's wife and one of the firm's senior partners, Alex Carter. Carter quickly pulled Helen aside, clearly aware of their affair. "Helen," he said in a low voice, "do you really think you should be here? His wife is just over there." Ignoring my presence, Helen responded, "Mr. Carter, I need to know how he's doing. I have to see him." Carter sighed, glancing over at Brian's wife. "You look awful, Helen," he said. "It's not looking good. His left side is paralyzed, and the doctors say his organs are failing. They don't know what's causing it, but if they can't stop it, he won't make it through the weekend." Tears streamed down Helen's face. "Please, Mr. Carter, help me. I need to see him. Can you distract his wife? Just for a minute?" Reluctantly, Carter led Brian's family away, while I escorted Helen into Brian's room. The sight of him was jarring. His left side hung limp, his face slack, and his eyes dull. Helen rushed to his side, hugging and kissing him as I stood silently by the door, disgusted. She wept over him, her sobs filling the room, until a nurse came in and firmly asked her to leave. As the nurse helped Helen out, I stayed behind. Brian's eyes widened when he saw me, and he struggled to speak, but no sound came out. I leaned closer, my voice cold and steady. "Brian, you're going to die soon," I said. "Before you do, I want you to know something. I didn't accept your twisted arrangement. And don't worry, I'll make sure your wife knows exactly what you did to me and mine. Just so you know before the end. I did this to you, and there's nothing you can do about it." As the alarms on his monitors blared, I stepped out of the room. Nurses and doctors rushed past me, their focus on keeping him alive. They managed to stabilize him temporarily, but Brian passed away early Monday morning. Helen was inconsolable when she got the news. By then, her own health had worsened. When I picked up Sandra from daycare that Monday, Helen was still in bed, looking as frail as ever. "I guess you're going to gloat now," she said bitterly. "No, Helen," I replied calmly. "I'm not going to gloat, but I won't pretend I'm upset either. That man destroyed our marriage, and he got exactly what he deserved." "Our marriage isn't dead," she argued, her voice weak. "I can't believe how cruel you're being about Brian. Nothing I had with him changed how I feel about you. It was all for us, for our future. I always intended to come back to you." I shook my head. "Helen, our marriage died the moment you chose him. And don't forget, I was in that room. I saw you profess your love for him, hugging and kissing him with me standing right there. There's no coming back from that." Her sobs grew louder as I walked out of the room. By the end of the week, Helen's condition had deteriorated further. On Friday, I had no choice but to take her to the hospital. The next morning, a doctor met with me. "Mr. Hayes," he began gravely, "your wife's organs are shutting down. Her blood work shows dangerously high levels of mercury and another toxin commonly found in seafood. Does she eat a lot of sushi?" I fought to keep my face neutral. "Yes," I said. She and her boyfriend ate sushi regularly. The doctor's eyebrows shot up. "Boyfriend? You probably know him," I said casually. "Brian Price, the man who died here earlier this week. They were having an affair." The doctor nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. Even though his death was ruled a stroke, her symptoms are almost identical to his. Unfortunately, her condition is critical. Her kidneys have already failed. It's only a matter of time." He led me to her room, where Helen lay hooked up to multiple machines, looking fragile and ghostly. Her eyes lit up weakly when she saw me, and she gestured for me to come closer. Her breathing was labored, and she seemed to struggle with every word. "I'm so sorry, Ryan," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her breathing was labored, and tears filled her eyes. "I realize now how much I've hurt you. The doctor told me I don't have much time. I need to know you forgive me before I go." I leaned in close to her, my face calm as I prepared to respond. Helen managed a faint smile, likely mistaking my closeness for reconciliation. In a low voice, I began, "My dear wife, on our wedding day, I pledged my undying love to you, for better or worse, in sickness and in health. And on that same day, you vowed to love and remain faithful to me." Her fragile smile began to fade as I continued. "But you broke those vows. You betrayed me, humiliated me, and destroyed the family we built together. I will never forgive you for what you've done. You and your lover deserve to burn in hell." I straightened up, watching a single tear roll down her cheek as the monitors in the room started to blare. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room. Less than an hour later, Helen was pronounced dead. Telling Sandra that her mother wouldn't be coming home was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I cried that day, but not for Helen. I wept for my daughter, who had lost her mother. Helen had tried to destroy me, but in the end, I had beaten her to it. The doctors believed Helen and Brian were victims of tainted sushi. When Helen's body was released to the funeral home, there was no autopsy, no investigation, and no police inquiry. I made sure to destroy the remaining bottles of creamer and the vials of toxins hidden in the house. I even retrieved the partially used bottle of creamer from Helen's office when I cleared out her belongings. When I chose to have Helen cremated, her parents protested, citing their religious beliefs against cremation. I didn't care. I wanted her body gone, and with her ashes, any lingering evidence was erased. You might think I'd feel satisfied after taking revenge on Helen and Brian, but I wasn't finished. I made copies of the recordings I'd gathered and began the next phase of my plan. My first stop was the home of Margaret Price, Brian's widow. Why confront her after her husband's death? I needed to know if she'd known about the affair and whether she had allowed it to happen. I strongly suspected she did. Margaret invited me into her home, and as I stepped inside, I turned on the small recorder in my pocket. "Mrs. Price," I began, I'm here to talk to you about your husband and my wife." She interrupted me before I could say more. "You can stop right there, Mr. Hayes. I know exactly why you're here. I was well aware of my husband's affair with your wife. They weren't exactly discreet about it. And let me tell you, this wasn't his first affair, but it was certainly his last." "Thank you for your honesty," I said, my tone icy. "But let me be clear. You knew your husband was seducing my wife, turning her against me and our daughter, and you did nothing to stop it. That makes you just as guilty as he was." Margaret's expression hardened. "I had no part in Brian's actions," she said defensively. I shook my head. "We'll have to agree to disagree, Mrs. Price. If you'd stepped in, maybe your husband wouldn't have felt so free to do what he did. Maybe my daughter would still have a mother. But the fact that you knew will be helpful when I go after his estate for the pain and suffering he caused my family." Without giving her a chance to respond, I stood up and walked out of her house. My lawyer had warned me that pursuing Brian's estate was a long shot, but I didn't care. I wanted retribution. My next target was the law firm where Brian and Helen had worked. My lawyer believed they would resist any claims against them, especially with Brian gone. But that changed when I revealed one of the recordings I'd captured, a conversation between Brian, Alex Carter, and Helen in her office. In it, they discussed their plans to destroy me if I refused to comply with their arrangement. Carter even mentioned knowing cops, prosecutors, and judges who owed him favors, which he could use to resolve the situation. Although my lawyer warned that the recording might not hold up in court, we decided to use it as leverage. She arranged a meeting with the firm's senior partners, including Alex Carter. Without telling them the real reason for the meeting, she hinted it might involve a life insurance matter. When we arrived, the 7 senior partners, including Carter, greeted us with polite condolences for Helen's passing. The firm's managing partner, Ramon Holden, stood to address me directly. "Mr. Hayes, we are deeply sorry for your loss. We understand there have been some complications with the life insurance policy. I'm pleased to inform you that we've resolved the issue. Here is a check for $600,000 from the insurance company." I accepted the check with a nod, slipping it into my pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Holden," I said. "But that's not why we're here. We're here to discuss a much more serious matter. Your firm's involvement in a plot to seduce my wife, destroy my family, and have me arrested." Holden's expression darkened as he stood up, visibly angry. "How dare you come in here and make such baseless accusations? We will not tolerate this." I remained calm. "We can leave right now, Mr. Holden. But before you dismiss me, I suggest you ask Mr. Carter if what I'm saying is true." All eyes turned to Carter, who was visibly squirming in his chair. His silence spoke volumes. My lawyer took out her phone and played the recording. Brian's and Carter's voices filled the room, detailing their scheme to destroy me. Holden looked stunned. "Mr. Hayes," he said finally, "give us a moment to discuss this privately." After 30 minutes, Holden returned, his demeanor subdued. "What are your demands?" he asked. "Your firm will pay $5 million to me and my daughter," I replied, "or we'll file suit and make these recordings public. Not only will Carter be disbarred, but the reputations of your entire firm and the prosecutors and judges named in the recordings will be irreparably damaged." Holden stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "We'll draw up the paperwork." Holden asked for 2 days to discuss my offer with the other partners. My lawyer, ever firm, responded, "You have exactly 2 days to decide. If we don't hear back, everything becomes public." True to their word, 2 days later, my lawyer called with the outcome. "They've agreed to your terms," she said. "The $5 million will be paid in full, and they've included a clause to expel Alex Carter from the firm under their morality policy. He'll lose 90% of his partnership share. In exchange, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing you from speaking about Brian Price's actions or the firm's involvement." The terms were acceptable, so I signed the agreement and took the settlement. In a cruel twist, Helen had been right about one thing. Her affair had indeed secured our financial future, though not in the way she'd imagined. With the legal battles behind me and the financial strain lifted, I finally had the chance to step back and reassess my life. The chaos of the past few months had consumed me, but now it was time to focus on what truly mattered: my daughter, Sandra. Though the scars of betrayal remained, I began to see this as a turning point. The weight of my past was heavy, but it no longer controlled me. I used the settlement money to ensure Sandra had everything she needed to thrive. I focused on giving her the kind of life she deserved, one filled with stability, love, and happiness. We took trips to places she had always dreamed of visiting, spent weekends fishing and hiking, and even revisited hobbies I'd neglected during the dark days of my marriage. For the first time in years, life felt lighter. One sunny afternoon, while taking Sandra to her favorite burger joint, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Karen. She had a warm, kind presence that immediately put me at ease. Like me, she had endured her own share of heartbreak but had emerged stronger. She worked as a therapist, helping people navigate their struggles, and her compassion was evident in every word she spoke. Karen and I connected quickly, not just because of the pain we had both experienced, but because of the resilience we had found in ourselves. She admired my determination to protect Sandra and rebuild our lives, and I admired her strength and empathy. As our relationship grew, I found myself laughing again, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in what felt like a lifetime. Karen never pushed me too fast. Instead, she offered a steady hand as we charted this new chapter together. Sandra adored her, and seeing my daughter so happy made me realize just how far we'd come. Slowly but surely, we became a family. With Karen by my side, I no longer felt like I was facing life alone. She brought a sense of warmth and connection that I hadn't thought possible. Together, we built a life that felt genuine and full of love. In time, I learned to forgive, not because I had forgotten what happened, but because I realized that holding on to bitterness would only tether me to the past. Forgiveness wasn't for Helen or Brian. It was for me. It was the key to moving forward. I finally had the future I'd always wanted: a loving family, a peaceful life, and a second chance at happiness. Sandra thrived, surrounded by love and support, and her joy became my greatest reward. Though our past had been fractured, we had found a way to heal and move forward as a family. In the end, life taught me that even in the aftermath of betrayal and loss, there is hope, there is love, and there is always a path forward for those willing to take it. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel. Bye.